Good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from London, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. An interesting trial in Washington, D.C. is coming to a close. It's of five members of the so-called Proud Boys, a right-wing extremist militia which was intimately involved in the storming of the US Capitol back on January the 6th, 2021. This trial has certainly shown spotlight, not just on the Proud Boys, but on a number of far-right extremist groups operating today in the United States. And it always, therefore, in my mind, begs the question of, do we have a similar problem with right-wing terrorism in Europe? And at first sight, the answer is unfortunately yes. You'll remember the attack on a Norwegian Labour youth summer camp back in 2011 by Anders Behring Breivik, a Norwegian far-right radical, which killed 77 people. There have been also attacks, albeit less serious, against migrant centres in Halle in East Germany, against LGBT parades in Bratislava, Slovakia, and also against gay nightclubs back in Norway, to name just a few. We now know that there are quite a large number of far-right groupings in Europe. In the old days, they used to coalesce mainly around support for certain football teams. Lazio in Rome was a notorious example, or in biker groups, or in skinhead groups, or shooting clubs. But the COVID years, where many young people have been locked down in front of their computer screens, has certainly increased the tendency for leaderless networks to develop of quite rapidly self-radicalized teenagers and young people acting as lone wolves. The attacker, for example, in Bratislava was only 21 years old. And of course, unlike the football hooligans or the skinheads, these people have not been on police radar screens and are more difficult to detect. Now, there are a number of different motivations for people to join far-right groupings or organizations. Some are purely seeking thrills. Others are motivated by sort of cultural factors. Others by racism. Some are neo-Nazis, for instance. Some are very much in the anti-Muslim type of groupings. But they all seem to have certain features in common. A hatred of democracy, which is seen as corrupt and as not distributing economic dividends fairly, a distaste for the liberal international order, particularly obligations to finance the war in Ukraine on behalf of the Ukrainians, which they think is money that should be spent on our people back home, a love of conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement theory, popular in France, that Muslims are going to supplant white Frenchmen and rule France in the next couple of years. A very pessimistic view of social breakdown, the great American carnage, as Trump called it in his inaugural speech, and a belief that only the strong man is able to fix the problem. A sense that because society needs to be fixed quickly, accelerationism, the quick breakdown of society, is necessary through violence to allow the new order to emerge. A belief that people are not born equal and that races should be segregated because some are of inferior quality, and a masculine type of culture which doesn't really give much of a role for women. You don't see very many women in these far right groups. Now, given the dimension of the problem, it's a good thing that the EU is now taking it seriously. The Finnish EU presidency back in 2019 organized a discussion which produced an initial action plan. The Swedish presidency in the EU at the moment is usually doing a stocktake. And just last week, the Netherlands mission to the European Union organized a very useful conference in Brussels, bringing lawyers, practitioners and officials and academics together to see where we are and what needs to be done. And it's clear that when it comes to right-wing terrorism and radicalization, there are still gaps. The EU, for example, doesn't have a common definition of the ideology or which groups there are. And that makes it very difficult to identify certain groups and distinguishing between those who are letting off steam from those that are seriously planning terrorist actions. The EU still doesn't have a consolidated list of designated terrorist organizations on the far right, whereas, of course, it has been working on lists of jihadist and Islamist groups for many years. This is important because without these designated lists, which identify the ideology as key, there's an all too common tendency of EU courts to look at right-wing radicals simply as people who suffer from mental health problems, like the initial diagnosis of Breivik in Norway, or who are common criminals, and not recognize the importance of the ideology, which is really what is motivating the crimes. Our intelligence services clearly need to spend more time looking into the problem, having spent a lot of their time and resources, obviously over the last couple of years, looking at the jihadist threat from outside Europe. This is a threat from inside Europe. We have the issue of the police and the military, which are often infiltrated by these far-right groups. The police and the military are often on the outskirts or at least the margins of society when it comes to a certain isolation. They like the cult of secrecy, of camaraderie, of supporting each other. They're used to conducting operations. They're used to handling guns and explosives. And so it's easy for far-right radicals to hide out in these organizations. So the police and the military, the German Bundeswehr, for instance, had a problem some years ago, have to be able to identify these groups and root them out quickly. We need successful prosecutions, so particularly of groups that are trying to operate internationally across borders. And there was a breakthrough in this regard just last week when a court in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, successfully prosecuted the base, a kind of international of right-wing radicals led by an individual who is now hiding out, unsurprisingly, in St. Petersburg, Russia. We need, of course, to also look at the internet world, always central to radicalization. And in the case of the right-wing radicals, the gaming world is particularly important because many of teenagers who play video games like Call of Duty and others develop a sort of insensitivity towards violence, begin to confuse the real world from the virtual world, develop their own language or lingo, and are also people who award each other points or brownie points or promotions for being willing to carry out certain acts. It was quite interesting that the perpetrator of the attack in Bratislava immediately went online to ask his sort of peers how many points he'd scored by carrying out the attack, as if it was an online game. And these video games, of course, can be manipulated by the extremists to convey more terrorism content as well. So regulating the gaming world is going to be a key as well. The EU is building a so-called RAN, or Radical Awareness Network, of academic institutions, civil society groups, NGOs, which can share information, particularly at the local level, about radicalization activities, so that we can have more of preventive and less of a purely reactive policy as well. But looking to the future, it's clear that this is a problem. We need to fireproof our institutions, our parliaments, our media, our governments, our civil services, from conveying any kind of extremist content. We must not give these messages of hate any kind of respectability whatsoever. It's quite useful to see that Fox News in the United States recently paid out $800 million to settle a dispute regarding its false claims back in 2021 that the United States election had been manipulated. We need to train the police and the military, as I've said, to do a better job of policing themselves. And in the courts, we must have no double standards for the perpetrators of right-wing ideological attacks vis-a-vis left-wing or jihadist attacks. In Germany in the 1930s, it was not helpful that communists would be sentenced to lengthy jail terms, whereas right-wing ideologues like Adolf Hitler got off with just a couple of years in very comfortable circumstances in Landsberg prison in Bavaria. Let us not repeat that mistake. So the threats to the open society come from within as well as from without, and the EU needs a strategy to deal with both aspects. Thank you for watching and listening today, and I look forward to engaging with you very soon in the future.